try to talk to a group this big. It's going to be a little bit of a challenge. So we're handing out, and I really hope we printed enough of these. This is the these will be the please give them, because I only printed 80, and I'm beginning to think that might have been an underestimation. Wow. Okay, so it's great to see everybody. If you don't know who I am, my name is John Zino. You probably did not see my picture up on the screen, so I'm not officially associated with Ratio Christi, but I do come and speak occasionally, usually once or twice a semester. I do teach part-time at UNCW, so for those of you that have never had one of my classes, which I think Ariel is probably the only one who's been in one of my classes, I tend to move around a lot when I talk, and I use my hands a lot when I talk. And so we're going to try to keep this as interactive as we can. I'm going to try to be mindful of the time because we got a lot of material to cover. Okay, so we're going to study scientific naturalism tonight. But before we do that, somebody tell me in a very short, simple statement, the worldview that we studied last Monday night, deism. What is the basic premise behind the worldview of deism?
God created the world and then walked away.
Okay, the Clockmaker Universe. So God is creator, created the world, and in a mechanical, sort of clock-like fashion, the world ran, but there was no intervention beyond that. So he took his hands off, he walked away, and the world just continued to operate. What was the worldview we studied before that, which Kinza taught? Christianity, all right? What is the idea of God in Christianity? How does it differ from the idea of God in deism?
Personal.
Okay, God is personal. What else?
There is divine intervention, like Daniel Malines did.
Okay, so God interacts with his creation. He doesn't just wind it up and let it go. He actually interacts. Yes, Delaney.
There are miracles.
Miracles can happen, absolutely. What was one of the premises behind the worldview of deism? Are miracles possible? No. Why not? Because God doesn't interact with his creation. He winds it up and lets it go. So miracles by definition can't happen. Christian theism would say, yes, God can interact with his creation. So therefore miracles are possible, right? Okay, good. All right, so that's where we're starting tonight. We had Christianity. We had deism. Tonight we are going to look at the next, I'm going to try to get out of the way here, the next logical step in the progression of worldviews. So we started here with Christian theism. Grant talked about deism. Tonight we're going to talk about scientific naturalism. This is a very extremely important worldview for you to understand. And we'll get into the reasons why that is as we go through. This is probably the most common and most predominant worldview that you will run into on campus. You don't have to be a scientist or even somebody who particularly likes science to hold this worldview. In fact, most people who hold this worldview aren't scientists. They unknowingly adopt this worldview, as many scientists do, because it seems like it's a very rational, very logical worldview to adopt. And so scientific naturalism came out of deism in the 18 and 1900s. So whereas we saw deism, God was reduced, he was just creator, he no longer interacted with his creation, and he has no personality, we now see scientific naturalism entering the scene in the 18 and 1900s, really in the 1800s, 19th century, where God is further reduced and his existence is completely eliminated altogether. So this is a big step to go from a God who's personal, infinite creator, to a God who, well, just winds it up and lets it go, to a God who doesn't even exist at all. So this was the first real shift toward a predominantly atheistic worldview. Now, there were atheists in the past. The ancient Greeks had many atheistic views, but this was one that really began to take hold in the 1800s. And we're going to look at a little of the historical reasons why that was. And this is the one, as I said, that predominantly still shows up a lot today, particularly in academia, university campuses and colleges. This is a very predominant, very prolific worldview. Okay, so the slow fade. This is basically, essentially how it happened. And Grant talked about this a little last week. You've got the age of reason in the 17th century, people beginning to recognize the importance of human reason, the ability for human beings to think and to rationalize and to be able to understand the world through their innate sense, autonomous human reason. A number of very famous philosophers, John Locke, began to realize, well, you know what? Human reason can also be used to understand God. Because after all, if God created everything and the laws of logic rule the universe and God created those and the worlds and the world and the galaxies, we ought to be able to use human reason to understand God, which actually is not a bad way of thinking, because we do recognize that you can learn a lot about God just by looking at creation, by looking at the world around us. However, things began to take a turn for the worse later on in the century when naturalists began to extend this idea to say, you know what? We really don't need divine revelation at all. We're learning so much and we're so reliant on human reason that actually human reason can really be the sole arbiter of truth apart from divine revelation. And this is where we start to see the departure, where things like miracles are not possible, where divine revelation in Scripture isn't really necessary. We can learn everything we need to know about God or about the universe around us just based on our own human reason. The implications of this shift were staggering, because as this thinking began to progress, people really started to rely solely on the faculties of human reason to determine everything, not just whether or not God existed, but how to interact with the world, how to relate to one another. I think James Sire does a nice job with this quote. He says, in deism, we have only a vague notion of what God might be like. Naturalism, on the other hand, was and is serious business. And it really is serious business. So I want to take some time to just go through this to make sure you appreciate how significant this worldview is, how predominant this worldview is, how pervasive this worldview is. Okay, so we went through, and Kinza did this and so did Grant. We're going to describe some of the attributes of the worldview. We got our worldview glasses here. Our worldview of scientific naturalism. And we're just going to step through these one at a time. Nature is all that exists. There is nothing metaphysical or supernatural. So there's nothing outside the natural physical world. So right off the bat, what has been eliminated when we look at the second point? God, right? Because God, if God does exist, is not physical. He's not natural. He would be outside of nature. He'd be supernatural, metaphysical. Nothing non-physical exists. Here's where things get interesting. Ideas or concepts like the soul, the spirit, the mind don't really exist either. They're really just biochemical processes, right? Because matter and nature is all that exists. There really isn't anything non-material about you as a person. So what you think is your mind is actually just your physical brain. And the synapses and the hormones and the biochemicals that are going on, there really isn't a mind. It's just your brain. It's just the organ of your brain. Just like your heart is an organ, well, your brain's an organ. There really isn't anything metaphysical about your mind. God does not exist, obviously, because nothing outside of nature exists. The mind equals the brain. Here's where things get a little slippery. Science and math are the only ways to determine truth. Now, I'm just going to, by a simple show of hands, I want people to raise their hand if you've ever heard anybody make a statement like that. Not bad, almost the whole group. You can't set 1 foot on a college campus and not hear this statement. You cannot. I dare you. You cannot do it. It is everywhere. Only things that can be empirically verified by science and math are true. That's an assumption of scientific naturalism. Essentially, what that says is anything that's not measurable, observable, testable, physical, really is just nothing more than opinion. So any sort of religious or philosophical, moral or ethical judgments, aesthetic, value, beauty judgments, really don't contribute much of anything to society. They're just nice things, but they really don't amount to anything. It's really just opinion, right? And everybody has an opinion. So only things of math and science that can be empirically verified are actually true. Now, what kind of things what kind of problems, potential problems, might you see with a worldview like this?
Abortion.
Okay. So, in what way?
Doesn't matter. Kill it.
Okay.
It's my opinion versus yours.
Okay, so that would be an ethical or moral judgment, which doesn't really have any value. Yes?
I suppose technically we could put cells and water and stuff and bones in a bucket, twist around a little bit, and it could pop out a human.
In principle, a scientific naturalist would say that Sara right here, if we were to take Sara, she's composed of all these chemicals, right? There she is, or carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, right? And if we were to take her and melt her down into a bucket that had the exact same chemical composition as this Sara, a naturalist would say there's no difference between those two. Because after all, she's just physical matter. The mind, the brain, the soul do not exist.
I'm just a meat machine dancing to my piano.
That's right. You're just a biochemical machine. And so your collection of molecules here is just different than your collection of molecules here. But it's all just molecules. What's the big deal? Yes, Jennifer.
The slide before that said that nothing non-physical exists.
Correct.
But gravity's non-physical, and we know that it exists.
Yeah, but gravity is going the wrong way. Gravity is verified empirically by the laws of science and math. So yes, you're right. It's not physical, but it can be quantified by science and math. So it's good. From a scientific naturalist standpoint, if you can measure it and test it and observe its effects, we're all good, right? It's a good point, though. Very good point. Yes?
So the humans and animals are like the exact same.
100% the exact. We're just different arrangement of molecules, right? Which would go back to the abortion, comment. Yes?
So if it can't be measured or can't be defined empirically, does that mean that it just can't exist?
It does exist, but it has no significance. So, like, can you measure the beauty of the Mona Lisa? No, you can't.
Right, but what does scientific naturalists say? Well, that's just a bunch of colors put on it.
There you go. Just a bunch of colors on the thing. You just happen to think it's really beautiful. I think it's junk. Right? Right? Because nobody can measure how beautiful it is. You can't measure how beautiful. It's like trying to measure how angry I am. There's no measurement or how happy I am. These are not measurable quantities. They really contribute little or nothing to society. That's what a scientific naturalist would say. Yes?
What do they say about psychology?
Oh, all right. You are about 8 slides ahead of me. Just hold that thought. We're going to introduce you to a good friend of mine, Dr. Freud. Yes?
With the happy and angry, though, surely you could just measure them onto endorphins or synapses in the brain. Wouldn't that help you?
You could, but that would just be a measure of those physical quantities.
That's how they'd quantify that.
Correct. But it wouldn't, because you and I could have the same change in endorphins, but I could be way happier than you. Right? Right. There's no sort of absolute way of measuring the effect. Yes?
Why does someone have to be honest with their measurements?
What do you mean, honest?
Like the data they collect, why does it have to be accurate?
Which data?
Like the scientific data, like gravity's 9.8 meters.
Yeah.
Why can't they just say it's like 8.2 meters?
Because it can be falsified. If you tell me gravity is 8.2 meters per second squared, I can go out here and do an experiment and prove to you that's wrong. And Grant can do it, and Lexi can do it, and everybody can do it. So it's falsifiable, right? And you could still choose to believe it's 8.2, but we would say you've been false. It's been falsified.
Science can tell you the way things are.
Oh, you are so. You guys have seen my slides. You all have seen my slides. We're going to talk about that in a minute.
Well, if morality falls into
Yes.
personal preference,
Yep.
what happens when you disagree with someone who gets the higher sort of up on that, who gets to be right out of it too?
Yeah, that's the problem there. And we'll talk about the logical outworkings of that when we look at the social implications of scientific naturalism. And we're going to look at a guy named Nietzsche and a gentleman named Marx, who had some fascinating ideas on these subjects. Yes?
It also takes away value from human life.
Oh, no
There's
question.
A lot of effects on kind of everything, like
Yeah.
religion,
Sure.
philosophy, morality,
Yep.
all of that.
Yep. Anything that can't be measured or tested or verified is just your opinion. And it's like vanilla ice cream or chocolate ice cream.
So 2 questions.
Yes.
How do scientific naturalists answer the question, how do they answer the question, why is there something, not nothing?
We'll get to that. They can't.
That's the first one.
They cannot.
And the second isn't really a question, but our ability to measure and our idea of the natural world
Yep.
is going to be different. For example, Newtonian physics
Yep.
described the world in a certain way. Quantum mechanics changed
Yep.
a lot.
Mhm,
So does that mean that, you know what I'm saying? So in other words, there are truths that have yet to be discovered.
Right. So yes, Newtonian physics describes macroscopic bodies in motion, planets, stars, me and you. Quantum mechanics describes things that are subatomic, electrons, neutrons, protons. So Newtonian physics does apply to atoms, but the forces are so small, it's insignificant. Electron doesn't weigh very much, right? So yes, we discover new truths about reality, but reality's always been that way. But yeah, as long as it can be measured, scientific naturalists will say then it's that's something that's correct, it's true, right? So truth is defined by what you can measure and test.
I do believe that by looking through history, there are things that science cannot explain, and in the scientific realms too. I do believe, I'm a business major, I'm not a science major, but I do remember reading things in nuclear physics that scientists have not been able to explain, and may never be able to explain. But I also believe that as a Christian looking through history, if you are an objective scholar, it does point to God. There have been very coincidental events, whether it's in the formation of this country or in the formation of the state of Israel, that really can't be explained scientifically.
Right. And the way a scientific...
They can't get around that.
Sure, and the way a scientific naturalist would answer that is, hey, everybody wins the lottery every now and then. Right? I mean, if you take enough shots at goal, you're going to score, right? So just because something is a low probability doesn't mean it couldn't happen, right? But yes, they would try to explain that in terms of probability and statistics, right? It's just likelihood, right? And that's how they would explain the universe. Hey, eventually we would have come into existence, right? So we're here. Yes?
With this view, euthanasia would make sense.
Oh my goodness, would it ever? Because there's no real difference than, killing, let's say, a dog that has cancer, right? Or a cat or whatever. Yeah, right. Oh, an elderly person, certainly. Or abortion. Yeah, exactly. Right, because if really we're just a collection of molecules, that's really what it comes down to. Okay, so Grant's giving me the roll forward sign. So, all right. These are the, thank you, Grant, because I do tend to go, we do tend to chat. All right. 8 important questions. Grant did these. Kinza did these. I will just show them. Prime reality, the nature of external reality. These are the questions a worldview has to answer, right? So we're going to put scientific naturalism to the test. What is a human being? What happens when you die? How can we know anything at all? How do we know what is right and wrong? Moral or ethical assessments, judgments. What's the meaning of human history? And what personal life-oriented commitments are consistent with this worldview? Okay, here we go. Question number 1, what is prime reality? This is super simple. Matter is all that exists, and that's it. Matter is prime reality. God doesn't exist. Nothing supernatural exists. Matter is prime reality. Physical matter. Molecules, compounds, elements, whatever. Matter is prime reality. God does not exist. Now, some naturalists will say matter exists eternally and is all that exists. That gets a little dicey because then how did it all begin? And we'll talk about that. There's a little bit of an internal conflict with scientific naturalism and scientists, because many scientists now believe that the universe did begin to exist, which means matter would not be eternal, but we'll get to that in a minute. But either way, matter is prime reality. Matter is, so really there's nothing, Sara just has this material composition, and when she dies, her body will be in the ground and it'll change to another material composition. Because after all, she's just elements and compounds, and then she'll be elements and compounds in the ground. Done. Right? That's all there is to scientific naturalism. Any questions on that? That's usually a pretty straightforward one. Okay, the cosmos. So now take it from humans to the cosmos. The cosmos exists as a uniformity of cause and effect in a closed system. My buddy Carl Sagan, you've probably heard this quote before, right? The cosmos is all there is, all there was, all there ever will be. That is textbook scientific naturalism. Straight up scientific naturalism. And in fact, it's a beautiful characterization of the scientific naturalist worldview. Matter is all there is, all there was, all there ever will be. So really, the events of human history or the world history are just matter changing forms and shapes, right? We had dinosaurs, they lived and they died, and then their matter somehow got rearranged into other animals, and now we're here. Maybe one day we'll all be gone and our matter will be reorganized into something else. Matter is all that exists. Cosmos is all that exists. Okay, human beings. This is where things get a little more interesting. So a scientific naturalist would say, well, we human beings are pretty complex. All right, I'll give you that. But really, we're just very complex biochemical machines. There really isn't anything special about us. We're just really advanced, complex biochemical machines. And what we call personality is really just the way our chemical and physical biological functions interact with one another. So there really isn't a person. It's just a particular arrangement of chemicals and compounds and molecules. Does that make sense? And if the chemicals and compounds and molecules changed, I'd be a different person. But I'm still just an organized, complex biochemical machine.
So, how would a scientific person or scientific naturalist say does an idea cause biochemical responses in the brain, or do biochemical responses in the brain cause the idea?
So what they would say is an idea doesn't exist. It's just biochemical responses. So when I stick my finger in this electric socket here and I get shocked, I didn't have the idea to do that. I just my biochemical synapses said, "Hey, that looks like a cool thing. I'm going to try that." Bzz, oh, and then I felt the electrical shock and I stopped doing that. There really isn't an idea because ideas are not physical, right? They're metaphysical. Right? And they have trouble explaining that, right? They have trouble explaining why right now I'm thinking of something that probably none of you would ever guess what I'm thinking of, but I have an idea in my mind that none of you know. It's known only to me. But they would say, no, that's just the chemicals in your brain making you think you have an idea. But it's really just chemicals and hormones. It's not really an idea because ideas are not material, right? Yes?
Do they have, I guess, when it comes to this worldview, an ideal version of what a human being is?
No, because we're constantly evolving. We're always getting better. And so, no, we're just along the evolutionary trail, and here we are in 2019. But there is no end point in their mind because there is no goal. So we're just evolving. And our chemicals are changing, and we're becoming more resistant to viruses. And maybe we're getting smarter. We're learning stuff about the natural world, and we're improving. But really, we're just a collection of chemicals. I know it's kind of strange. Yes.
Do they believe in anything at all morally, like do good and be good, or be nice to people?
They would just say that it's good to be nice to people because maybe they'll be nice to you, and they won't kill you when you're asleep. Right? They would say it's survival. They would say it's survival driven. So I'm nice to Sara because maybe she'll be nice to me one day, and that might help me survive. So it's good to be nice to Sara, but really Yes, correct. And what we'll learn about scientific naturalism, it's driven by a worldview that's called secular humanism, where humanity is placed above all things because God doesn't exist. So humanity is now at the top of the ladder. And so human survival is generally thought of as being the ultimate goal, right? Human flourishing is the ultimate goal, right? So, yeah, but you're right. There wouldn't be anything wrong with evil and good really don't exist. They're just opinions because they're moral judgments. So, okay, how are we doing? Are we doing on time? Good. Questions? Questions? Okay. All right, so here we go. So 5 minutes. I want you to think about these two questions. We've already kind of dealt with this. What problems do you see with the idea that matter is all that exists? Why don't you look at the second question? We already kind of did the first one. What are the implications that human personality or a human being is really just an interrelation of chemical and physical properties? If you really don't have a personality, if you're really not a human person, you're just a particular arrangement of organic and inorganic chemicals. What are the implications of that idea, that worldview?
Everything is vanity.
Okay, certainly that's a very good observation. Take 5 minutes and talk about it. Thoughts on, again, we sort of talked about the first question. So what about the second question? What do you think the implications are if you really don't exist as a person, you're just a particular organized combination of biochemical, physical mechanisms? What things could come out of that way of thinking? Yes.
I think you could justify, well, maybe not even justify, but just like I step on a bug, I could kill somebody.
Okay.
And those two would be the same thing.
Okay. So would there be any moral difference between killing a cockroach and killing a human?
No.
I hate to say it, but there really isn't any difference. Because the cockroach is a combination. It's got chemicals and molecules and matter, and here's this human, which it's different chemicals and compounds, but it's just carbon and oxygen and hydrogen. So what's the difference? Yes.
I mean, could it be argued that a human has more utility overall than a single cockroach?
Yeah, you could argue that. And that might allow you to justify why only certain people should be killed. Right? Because then if this person over here isn't very useful, then, kind of like a cockroach, right? But if it's somebody who is useful, well, maybe we keep them around, right? So that's a tough one. Yeah, you're right. Yes. Oh, there you go. Who gets to decide who gets to live and die, right? Who gets to decide whose molecules and chemicals are more valuable than somebody else's molecules and chemicals? Right. Okay, good. Yes.
I was thinking, if we say that we're just in a relation of chemicals and physical properties,
Yep.
Statistically, there could be someone who has the exact same arrangement as me.
It's possible.
That is possible.
Highly, highly unlikely, but certainly possible. Certainly possible. Right. Yes.
I want to read a quote.
All right. It's not because I used you as an example, is it? No, it's good.
All right. Pat burst in the door, having come straight from a frustrating faculty meeting. She said, "Paul, don't speak to me. My serotonin levels have hit bottom. My brain is awash in glucocorticoids. My blood vessels are full of adrenaline. And if it weren't for my endogenous opiates, I'd have driven the car into a tree on the way home. My dopamine levels need lifting. Pour me a cup of Chardonnay and I'll be down in a minute."
That is a scientific naturalist worldview. You're really just a collection of chemicals and biological material.
But is it wrong that any of those things are actually happening?
That is scientifically correct. But the question is there more than just chemistry and biology and physics going on?
Is that the defining factor?
Correct. Is that what we're going to talk about? What does it mean to be human? That's like question 4, 5, or 6, I think, right? Yes, somebody had a hand up. Yes.
So it's like everything predetermined, or like.
Oh, you have definitely read my slides. Yes, we'll get to that, but that is one of the pitfalls of this worldview, because on this worldview, could you really condemn somebody for being born a mass murderer? I mean, they just happen to get some bad chemicals. It's not their fault, right? I mean, their genes, their genetics, their DNA, they just lost the genetic lottery, and I don't know how you could really condemn them for doing something they couldn't help themselves.
And with that, what is the purpose then? Because if we're machines, every machine has a purpose. So, how did this sled come to be and decide this is what we're going to do?
Exactly. So we're going to talk about some of the fallacies with this worldview. But yes, Sarah, do you have your hand up?
Yeah.
Yes.
How does nature versus nurture kind of fit into the scientific?
I think they would say nurture is part of nature.
Okay.
So, because nature is all that exists. So nurture is just part of nature, and so nature is just the only factor that really plays here, right? It's a good question. Yes, Grant.
Another factor in play is time.
Time. Yes. Oh, the amount of time for.
Time that we have this evening.
Oh, that's another one. All right, there we go. All right. Nice.
I know the rest of the presentation, so I want you to get.
I know. Okay. All right. Any other thoughts on this before we go? Thank you, Grant. Grant is keeping me honest here.
No problem with someone saying a naturalist
beings are more useful, why is that objectively good?
Yeah.
Why are they authoritative?
Useful to whom? And who gets to decide, right? Which one is more useful? Yeah, exactly. Oh yeah, no, it becomes a... And then on what grounds are they the ones deciding? Right? Because if they're just a collection of biological molecules, why should they get to choose? If they're no different, if we're all the same biochemically, so why do they get to choose? Oh yeah, we'll get to that. All of this is going to be wrapped up in the worldview. And we're going to look at the influence of 4 incredibly influential men that took this thinking to its logical conclusion. And the results were horrifying. And I will just tell you that. Okay, all right, so here we go. Death. What happens at death? Well, actually, death is really easy. You basically just become worm food, as Lexi would say. You just, yeah, I put that in there for you, right? Because all it is just rearranging these chemicals into those chemicals. That's it. Your chemicals just go into a different place. That's it. So there really is nothing beyond death. When you die, whatever we would call personality and individuality, which are really nothing more than just chemicals anyway, stops being and it becomes something else. It becomes chemicals for, worm food or for plants or animals. Richard Dawkins, I think, sums this up beautifully. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect. If there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. That's nature. That's nature. That's the worldview of naturalism. Kierkegaard, I put this in there for Grant because he's a big Kierkegaard fan. Kierkegaard said, the thing is to understand myself, to see what God really wishes me to do, to find an idea for which I can live and which I can die. So Kierkegaard, as a Christian existentialist, not necessarily what I would call a true Christian theist, recognized that life and death really do have significance. Whereas Richard Dawkins would say, there is no significance. When you die, your chemicals just change shape and form and go into some other chemical composition, right? So the worldview has some pretty serious implications when you think about the outworking of it. How do we know anything at all? Grant had this last week. Through our innate autonomous human reason, including the methods of science, we can know the universe, the cosmos, and everything that is around us. So human autonomous reason is how we figure everything out. And that's it. There isn't anything beyond that because humanity, mankind, is at the top of the ladder. There is no God. And so our innate human reason is the ultimate decider of what is true and what's not true and how we can know things. So there's no divine revelation because God doesn't exist. Pretty simple, right? The ancient Greeks thought this. Some ancient Greeks thought this. I can promise you that man thought this. Karl Marx most definitely thought this. Man is the supreme being for man. That's it. We're all there is. Humans are it. Now we have the animal kingdom, but we are above that. And man is the measure of all things. Right? These ideas have been around for a very long time. But it wasn't until the 18th and 19th century that they really began to take hold as scientific advances began to develop. And we begun to learn more about the natural world. We began to realize, hey, you know what? Our autonomous human reason really is at the top of the ability to determine truth. And in fact, it's the only way to determine truth because God doesn't exist. All right, how do we know what is right and wrong? Hey, this is easy. Ethics is related to human beings only. We affirm that moral values derive their source from human experience. That's it. Ethics is autonomous and situational, needing no theological or ideological sanctions. Ethics stem from human need and interest. Translated, whatever helps humanity the most, that is what you can ethically justify. Think about that for a second.
So are we going to grant posthumous amnesty for the Nuremberg?
Yeah. Yeah. Think about what you can justify with that worldview. Human life has meaning only because we give it meaning. That's another scary thought. That since after all, our autonomous human reason is what determines truth, and God doesn't exist, we create meaning for ourselves. Now, how many of you have actually heard people, like, if you ever ask somebody, hey, what's the meaning of life? Many times the response you'll get is, well, whatever I decide it is for me, right? That's this. That's scientific naturalism. That's what this worldview is. I get to decide for myself. Meaning and purpose. That's it. Plain and simple. So yeah, this worldview shows up everywhere in today's society. But you may not realize that's what it is when you see it or hear it. All right? On this worldview, I don't know that we have time to have a discussion, but let's just kind of call out some answers. On this worldview, are there really any objective moral right and wrong? Are there any objective moral truths? No. There really aren't. There really are no moral objective truths. It's whatever is best for human flourishing, whatever is best for human society. Now, can you think of an example of something in our nation's past which was used, just think about this, which was used to justify that the idea of right and wrong is determined by what is best for society as a whole?
Slavery.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, well, right. Biochemicals don't exist. But think about it. On this view, you could make a very strong case for the thought, the idea, that 90% of a population should enslave 10%, because that would be best for society as a whole. Even though it stinks for the 10% that are enslaved, society as a whole could be better. That's a scary thought. Human flourishing and what is best for society is the ultimate measure of right and wrong, good and evil. I mean, again, not trying to get too political, but why do you think Hitler took the position he did in going and exterminating millions of Jews? Why did he do that? Aside from the fact that he hated the Jews, but what was his ultimate motivation? Do you know?
What was best for Germany?
Exactly. Purify the race, the Aryan. He thought of them as less than human. They were taking away resources from the rest of the people he preferred, his race, his Aryan race. Get rid of them. It's best for society as a whole. Why do you think we are able to justify abortion today? Because it's best for society. Nobody wants to be a mom with a baby. Oh, I got to give up my career. Oh, I got to drop out of college. I just have an abortion. It's best for you. I'm serious. This worldview is frightening when you think about the implications of where this can go. It really is astonishing. So you might not realize it, but those ideas are all couched in scientific naturalism. Because there's nothing unique about humans. We're just a certain collection of chemicals. Human history. What's the meaning of history? History is linear. I think that was similar to what Grant talked about with deism, linked by cause and effect, but without an overarching purpose. That's an interesting point, right? Because I think as Christians we would say, history is linear and it's linked by cause and effect, cause and events effect. But a naturalist would say, well, there really is no ultimate goal or meaning or purpose. It just is. Things are what they are. Yep, we had World War II. Oh, well, it is what it is, right? I mean, it just is what it is. There's no purpose for it overall. It's just living out the events of the natural world. Naturalists tend to fall into two categories, natural history and human history. Natural history would be sort of the origins of the cosmos. They generally point to the Big Bang. But when you really squeeze them on it, well, what caused it? Oh, it just happened. They have no real explanation. Why would a naturalist have trouble explaining the beginning of the universe?
Because they need matter, but matter can't exist in nothing.
Correct, right? So if matter is all that exists, how could matter create itself at the Big Bang? It couldn't. So the only way matter could come into existence is if something non-physical existed, which created the physical. Oh, but wait, nothing non-physical exists. I keep forgetting. Matter's all that exists. So they're kind of stuck in a circular argument. Matter's all that exists, but yet somehow matter created itself. That doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. And it doesn't, right? It's a completely circular argument. As Christians, we would say all of physical matter came into existence, but whatever made it couldn't be made of matter, had to be outside of space and time and matter. That would be what we would call God, a non-physical being. But in a naturalist worldview, that doesn't exist. So they're stuck with matter creating itself, or some inexplicable way matter just came into existence out of nothing. Not a very compelling argument. And if you really push them on it, you'll find that they really don't like to talk about that very much, because they don't have a really good explanation for it. Because they realize how absurd it sounds, right? But the only way they could try to explain it is to say something non-physical created it, but nothing non-physical exists, so they're right back to matter is all that exists.
Wouldn't they just be intellectually honest and say, we don't know, and they're good with that?
And many times they do. That's why I say with no explanation. The Big Bang with no explanation. It's just, we just don't know. It's one of those mysteries. Or sometimes you'll hear the famous, one day science will figure it out. That's another famous mantra. One day science will figure it out. We just don't know. We haven't gotten that far yet, but we'll get there. Don't worry.
Yeah, I mean that's the faith that some of these people have. The
Sure.
faith is that science will
Sure,
keep playing
sure,
out.
sure.
We do this for
Yep.
long enough, science will figure it out.
Sure.
We have faith in that.
Sure. And
faith
it's
in science.
well, faith in autonomous human reason to discover through the means of science the natural world. Right. Yes.
Are I guess the people who prescribe to this, do they believe that war is bad, or is it just?
It just is. It just is. It's not good or bad. There is no good or bad. There is no evil, right or wrong. It just is. It's just there it is.
Why is it that on like campuses, if people prescribe to this, then why would they say like any war that is like today?
Oh yeah.
Like, well, we need to be out
I
of
mean,
war.
on this worldview, racism is not a bad thing, and it's not a good thing. It just is.
But you can decide subjectively that it's wrong.
Right? If it's wrong for you, that's cool. Well, that's cool. But hey, that's just your opinion, right? Because I can't measure it. I can't observe it, I can't test it, I can't quantify it. So it's just your opinion.
But like Michael said, you could just decide something.
You could.
But you're not actually deciding anything.
Nope, correct.
You just are the chemicals.
That's it. His chemicals made him think that way, and so, oh well, there you go. Thank goodness his chemicals didn't make him a mass murderer.
Yeah.
Right, I mean, really, right?
We can pump chemicals into him to then make him a mess.
Well, I will tell you, there are people in the field of neuropsychology that think that since we are just, what that little verse that you read, that little story, since we are just biochemical machines, I can pump him full of biochemicals and change his personality and make him a different person, because he's not really a person, he's just a collection of chemicals.
Yeah, but it's like it's almost coming to the point where science will just create this pill that you take per day, and then you'll just have a very normal day. Like there will be no imbalances.
Yeah, but I'm not sure how you would define normal, but
Right.
yeah, I'm not sure how, right, yeah, right. So that's natural history. Human history is even more interesting. I'm sure you've heard this before. There's not a biology textbook on the planet that doesn't refer to Darwinian evolutionary theory as a fact. Survival driven explains the what, but not the why. Somebody had that a little while ago, right? No predetermined goal, only has the meaning we give it. Right? That's the mantra of naturalism, right? If we decide to give it meaning, it has meaning. If we don't, it doesn't, and that's the way it goes. No further explanation needed. Okay, and no predetermined goal, because there is no goal. There's no purpose. We're just here. We're just here, and our chemicals are here. Personal life-oriented commitments. This is probably the one that's most important for you. Naturalism itself does not imply any core commitment, but rather the people who hold this worldview, in many cases, just unknowingly adopt this worldview without even thinking about it. They just assume that matter is all that exists. They just assume nature is the sum total of reality. They just assume there is nothing non-physical or immaterial. They really have no evidence to support it. They're just assuming it's that way. And it shapes the way they see everything, because we just found out all the bad things that can happen when you go under that assumption. But really, the worldview is just assumed a priori without empirical verification. It's just assumed. And they never go back and revisit that worldview and ask the hard questions about it, like we're trying to do tonight. And this is one of the dangers of naturalism, is people, without even knowing it, just assume it and carry on their life as if nothing happened. Secular humanism and Marxism are the two forms of this that you'll see today. Secular humanism actually arose out of the Renaissance humanist movement, because the humanists in the Renaissance were humanists that studied the nature and character of humanity. That's why when you look at Renaissance paintings, what do you typically see? Any art majors out there? What is like the main subject of most Renaissance paintings?
David.
People, humans. You don't see fruit bowls. They didn't do fruit bowls. Well, maybe they did, but humans were the focus of the Renaissance, right? Humans were the focus of the Renaissance. Humanism. They studied humanity, the human being, as it reflected the nature of God, the image of God. But as time went on, they kind of just replaced the humanist part and it became secular humanism. No God. Now we're just studying humans because humans are now the most important thing in all of reality because God doesn't exist. So humanism actually became secular humanism. And that's what we see today. The other worldview that is very, very predominant is Marxism, a very strongly atheistic version of secular humanism. And we'll talk about this on the next slide, that God really is just a projection or a wish of humanity in our own thinking, if there is any thinking. And really, God doesn't exist. Religion is the opiate of the masses, as Marx once said. But religion and politics and economic oppression need to be eliminated at all costs. So that would include any religious views like Christianity. Marx was a staunch opponent of any organized religion, especially Christianity. But he hated all religion because he saw it as oppressive, right? Just like class distinctions and economic distinctions, he saw religion as a distinctive feature that separated people into different classes. And his view was we need to abolish all class distinctions. We need to be one big happy society, one big utopian society. So just abolish, right? No private property, no ownership of private property, right? Anybody read the Communist Manifesto? I encourage you to read it carefully and thoughtfully under the guidance of somebody you trust. You need to read that. You need to read it because you need to understand what that man's thoughts were, because he was a very, very strong scientific naturalist. And some of his thoughts on these things were really profound. Okay, these were the four biggies right here. Marx, Darwin, Nietzsche, and Freud. If you want to talk about how we got to where we are today, look no further than these four men. Within the period of about 50 years in the latter half of the 19th century, these four men changed the way everybody thought about humanity and society. And what's interesting about them is they were all in different fields, but they all approached their field from a scientific naturalist point of view. So for example, what was Karl Marx's famous writing? I just said it a minute ago. Communist Manifesto, all right? That there really is no class distinction. We are all equal. We should abolish all government and all forms of structure because it's oppressive. And this has now translated into what we see today. Marx's theories were economic primarily, but what we see today is that it has really morphed into social and political elements. A lot of what we see with the social justice movements today really stem from Marx's original thinking, from his original thoughts. Yes?
If Darwin was really a scientific naturalist and didn't believe in God or anything, why in The Origin of Species does he make multiple references to a creator?
Oh, we're getting there. We're getting there. Darwin started off as a theologian. He went to seminary. Uh-oh, Grant, that's not good, man. He was a natural theologian. He studied God through nature. And yes, that was the idea back in the 1800s, to study God through nature. Now, as time went on, his view did begin to change, but I'll show you a quote at the end that'll address that exact point. Yes?
So I'm not sure if this is right, but didn't he, at the end of his life, say that some of his research on natural selection was wrong, and there must be a God?
No, that's wives' tale. Sorry, not to jump on you.
But I will show you a quote. I'll show you a quote that was taken from his book, The Origin of Species, at the end, and you tell me what you think he meant by it. I will show you a quote at the end, and you tell me what you think he meant by it. But yes, he was a naturalist. He studied the natural world. Obviously, he observed natural selection. Right? You all heard the story, Galapagos Island, the finch beaks, right? They changed, right? And so, oh my goodness, adaptation, changes. Oh, wait a second. This must be a process of survival of the fittest. this must be able to explain natural selection, how preferentially this bird had this beak, it helped him survive, the other one died. Taking that idea to its logical conclusion, maybe we don't need an ultimate designer. Maybe nature is the designer. Maybe we don't need a God to create everything. Maybe nature mimics design by natural selection and adaptation. And when applied over a long enough period of time, maybe this explains where we came from. That was his idea. If you have a naturalistic worldview and you've eliminated God as a creator, you need to find a substitute, because clearly we're all here and we didn't just poof out of existence from nothing. So you've got to come up with an explanation of how we all got here. That was Darwin's idea. And eventually led to what we see today, which is, a very significant influence of Darwinian evolutionary theory, both macro and micro evolutionary theory. Okay, Nietzsche. Who knows Frederick Nietzsche? Who's read Nietzsche? So I want you to take a pencil or a pen or something in your hand, and I want you to circle the parable of the madman. Ariel, you don't have to do this. You already read it. I want you to go home tonight and Google The Parable of the Madman by Frederick Nietzsche. And I want you to read it slowly and think about it. That is the best explanation of the logical outworkings of a scientific naturalist worldview. To say that poem, that parable, is horrifying would be to do it an injustice. Nietzsche's insights were astonishing. In 1882, he saw the logical conclusion of a scientific naturalist worldview. It was profound what he discovered. What he wrote was profound. And I want you to read it and think about it. We did this in our uni class, and we struggled through it with the students, and I think it was really quite eye-opening. I don't think many of them had ever read it before, but you need to read it, because he had incredible insight into the human condition and what humanity would be without God. And I give the man credit. He had the guts to take naturalism to its logical conclusion. Blood and all, bruises and all. And he took it to its logical conclusion. And it was horrifying what he concluded. But it's a great parable. It's not very long. It should take you 10 minutes to read it. But I want you to read it and really think about it, because it really describes this worldview to a T. And it actually describes the logical outworkings of that view. Okay, Sigmund Freud. Somebody talked about psychology, or I don't know, I thought we did that a minute ago. Anybody ever had somebody say this to you? Well, your belief in God is just wish fulfillment. You just want God to exist. That's why you've created him in your mind. It's dream fulfillment, wish fulfillment, right? Anybody ever said that to you? You can thank Dr. Freud, because he was the one who came up with the concept of dream theory, dream fulfillment, wish theory. And that was applied to God. Oh, well, clearly, we all know God doesn't exist. We all know matter is eternal and infinite. Oh, that's why they came up with this crazy idea of God. It's wish fulfillment. It's wanting God to exist because it makes you feel better. It makes you feel like life has a purpose, but we really know it doesn't. But we understand you need to feel better about that. His ideas are still incredibly prevalent in our society today. I'm imagining if you took a course in psychology, you probably will run across some of these ideas. You probably don't even need to take a course in psychology to come across these ideas. But these four men had the most profound impact of the worldview of scientific naturalism as it carried into the 20th century. Now, scary thought of the night. When the Allied forces invaded Berlin and defeated Hitler, and they went into Hitler's mansion and found Hitler and Eva Braun dead on the floor, whose books do you think they found in Hitler's personal library? Every written work by that man was on Hitler's shelf. Practically every written work from this man and this man. Some from Darwin. But almost every written work of those three men, and a good majority of his, were found on Hitler's shelf. Coincidence? You can decide for yourself. But that's the logical outworking. What was Nietzsche's famous term, his famous phrase? God is dead. That you'll find that in the parable of the madman. Right? Might makes right. The will to power.
But he did say God is dead, trying to show that enlightenment had killed God, and all those bad things happening in the parable of the madman is an absence of God.
Correct. And he actually took it to its conclusion and said, what are we going to do without an anchor to hold us in place? Exactly. What's going to happen to us now that we've swallowed up the horizon, the sun, the moon? It's amazing. His insights were incredible. Yes.
What about Brave New World? Is that a naturalist point of view as well?
I would say yes, although I've not read it, so I don't know for sure.
Sounds about right.
It probably would fit into that category. Yep.
I'm not understanding. So Karl Marx did not like power hierarchies, but is not survival of the fittest always going to be a power hierarchy? Always.
It just is what it is.
Yeah, but
it's a power hierarchy, but not by humans. It's a power hierarchy with nature at the top.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because not all hierarchies, not all hierarchies are based on power. They can also be based on competence. So Darwin.
But isn't competence power in this?
I think it would be survival.
Well, it's yes, if you're better adapted to circumstances.
Correct.
You're going to get to the top of the hierarchy.
Correct.
Not because you're more powerful per se.
Right.
Because you've got better tools.
Sure. Like sometimes intelligence would be an advantage. You don't always have to be the biggest and strongest. Maybe be the smartest, and that would give you a survival advantage, right?
And that power, and that's how power is being defined in that.
Yeah, I would say it could be, but what Marx would say is that that power imbalances from social economic factors are what he wanted to get rid of, right? The wealthy, the proletariat, and the bourgeoisie, right? The power class struggles. Yeah, right, as long as it didn't affect him. So I'm telling you, very significant, the influence of these four men. I encourage you, in a thoughtful way, to read some of the writings of these men. You need to understand what they thought. You need to understand how they saw things, because you're going to run across this worldview, and you need to know where it came from and how it originated. Now, there were many other writers. It wasn't just these four guys, but these were the four primary ones that influenced many, many other writings and many other thinking, especially going into the 20th century. Yes?
Yeah, I was about to say, I think a lot of the kind of like the scientific aspect of it, I think coming from Darwin in the 1800s, like the biological era of criminology led to like a lot of criminologists, especially in the Italian schools, saw criminals as, they're like face shapes and head shapes in certain ways.
Yep.
They eventually did the extreme camp of those people who said criminals have this head shape and this, they would go ahead and exterminate.
Sure. Because after all, they're not making any choices. It's just their biochemicals that are causing them to behave this way. And so if they have a certain face shape or certain eye shape, they must be a murderer. Take care of them, get rid of them. Because after all, human flourishing is the ultimate goal. And clearly these guys are not helping human flourishing. Let's get rid of them, right? So yeah, absolutely. You could justify almost anything on this worldview if you really took it to its logical conclusion. So yes, good observation. Okay, how are we doing on time? All right, we're getting close. Okay, so some problems with scientific naturalism. Yeah, there are a bunch of problems with scientific naturalism. Okay, probably the biggest problem is science itself, because science points to a cosmic beginning, but yet naturalists who in many cases revere science recognize that science is telling them matter is not eternal. It must have come into existence somehow. And we've never seen an instance where matter creates itself, at least not in any recent time. So there is a strong internal incoherence and inconsistency here. And that's why I say if you really want to press a naturalist, start talking about the ultimate beginning of the universe, because they will have a lot of trouble answering that question, because they're going to have to point to something outside of nature which doesn't exist in their worldview. And they know nothing can't create something. So they're kind of left trying to figure out what that something was that existed before matter existed, because their worldview won't allow that, right? Deep logical incoherence. If we are all the products of biological evolution, adaptation over time, there's a really strong and important question to ask yourself. If human rationality and logic and consciousness are the result of a process that has no purpose and no meaning and no intention, then why do we trust our minds to be able to perceive reality correctly? Why do we even trust logic if logic itself was not created by a logical process? Why do we trust consciousness and rationality if the process that created us was neither conscious nor rational? Serious problem. In my mind, a real serious problem. Why do we even trust our minds to think the thoughts that we do if there was no intelligence, if nature is what created those thoughts in the first place, or what created us to create these thoughts? So there's a deep logical incoherence in scientific naturalism that naturalists cannot explain. They cannot explain it. They'll just say, well, it just is what it is, but there's no explanation for it. But really and truly, there's no reason to trust our rational faculties. I mean, would you trust if I told you that I have a computer program that wrote itself, and here's the output of that program that wrote itself, no intelligence went into that computer program, it wrote itself, and here's the output. How much trust would you have in the output of that computer program if no intelligence went into writing the program in the first place? You probably wouldn't have a lot of confidence, but that's exactly what naturalists believe. There was no intelligence in the process that created us, but yet somehow we're intelligent and rational and conscious, and we have free will, but yet that process contains none of those attributes, but yet it created all of us that do. Yes?
Have you personally, John, ever asked somebody this and you gotten a pretty good answer about it?
No, you get the deer in the headlights look.
Okay.
Yeah, you really do. They have no good answer for this. They really don't. And I feel bad for them because they truly have never thought about this in this way. And I say that with as much compassion as I can because this used to be my worldview. It used to.
Amen.
And I mean, it's horrifying to see people thinking this is a reasonable worldview. It's amazing. Smart people thinking the dumbest things I've ever seen. It's really incredible.
I mean, and perhaps some of these implications find their root in the fact that the people who have this worldview are not asking philosophical questions,
Right.
because they only are asking scientific questions, and science is not going to give them the
Correct.
answers for
Right.
these questions.
Right, because philosophical questions have no value, have no meaning, just like ethical and moral judgments have no value and no meaning, because you've taken those off the table. But there are no scientific answers for some of these things, right? In fact, science presupposes logic and reasoning in order to be able to come to a conclusion, but yet there's no explanation for logic and reasoning. If the process that created us had no logic and reasoning, but yet here we are. Self-defeating, I mean, I only believe things that can be proven by science. Somebody please tell me what's wrong with that statement. Yes. If that's true, then why should I believe that sentence? Because that sentence can't be proven by science. That sentence is not provable by any known means of science. It's a statement of philosophy. So if it's true, you only believe things that can be proven by science, you've just proven the statement false, because you do believe something that can't be proven by science, namely that sentence. It's self-defeating. It defeats itself. But yet I can't tell you how many people I run across who who have said those exact words to me. I mean, that's like me telling you I can't speak a word of English. Right? I mean, the minute I utter the sentence, it defeats itself. What's the only way you could prove nature is all that exists? Yeah, you'd have to be outside of nature to prove that. But if you're outside of nature, is nature all that exists? No. It defeats itself. It's the most ridiculous thing. How in the world do people think this? Metaphysical incoherence. Why do we trust our own minds? Obviously, we talked about existential, moral, ethical judgments. Physical determinism. Who had the physical determinism? Right? Do we really have any free will? Aren't we just like biological robots? We're doing what, right? We really don't have any free will. Brilliant scientists, when asked this question, will say, yeah, we really don't have free will. We really don't have... Consciousness is an illusion. Rationality, it's an illusion. We just think we're conscious. We just think we're rational. We just think we have free will. It really doesn't exist. Seriously.
How can they rationalize that statement?
It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. It's truly incredible. They can't. They have no explanation for it.
So all of us at one point will hear a challenge like that. You don't have free will. Consciousness is an illusion. How would you refute something like that? I know that's a big question, but could you, I don't know, give it to us in a pill?
I mean, you asking me?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, consciousness is an illusion. Are you conscious right now when you're saying that to me? Because if consciousness is an illusion, then how do I know you're really conscious when you make that statement? If free will is an illusion, oh, did you freely come to that conclusion? Or were you predetermined to come to that conclusion? Because if you're predetermined to come to that conclusion, you couldn't have come to any other conclusion. How do I know it's right? Right? Did you freely choose to ask me that question? Or were you predetermined to ask me that question? It's absurd. It is absurd, the things that you hear come out of people's mouths when it comes to these physical determinism. This really speaks more to the moral and ethical judgments. Because if we're all physically predetermined, like I said before, you can't really criticize anybody for being a mass murderer because his genes made him do it, right? He didn't have any choice. His DNA was just bad, right? And because he wasn't really freely choosing to do anything because he doesn't have free will. He had to go commit murder. Hitler had to kill all those Jews because we don't have free will. He's just biologically driven that way. The KKK, they're just biologically driven to be racists. It's not really their fault. They're not choosing anything. There is no free will. They're not choosing anything. How can you condemn sexism? How can you condemn anything if their free will doesn't exist? It's crazy. And the people that I meet who make these statements are the ones who get ballistic angry when if somebody makes a racist comment or a sexist comment or is homophobic, they go ballistic. But yeah, wait a minute. There's no free thinking here. This is just my DNA responding. Why are you getting mad at me? It's my DNA. You can't get mad at me, right? I couldn't help it. I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy. And their moral intuition knows that sexism is wrong, racism is wrong, that evil exists. But yet they choose to behave like free thinking doesn't exist. But yet every part of their being says the opposite. Because they know intuitively evil does exist. They know there are things that are just wrong, which requires a choice, which means free will is needed. But yet they deny free will exists. It's logically absurd. It really is absurd. Okay, any questions on that? Any questions on sort of the problems with this? Okay. I'm not going to show that. Okay, so the takeaways. So scientific naturalism is not science. Scientific naturalism is not science. It is a worldview that is assumed to be true, but has never empirically verified. Now, the problem with scientific naturalism is that many smart scientists hold this worldview, and most people think, oh, they're scientists. They must know what they're doing. But that's the problem. It's not a scientific fact. It's a philosophical worldview. Because you can never prove nature is all that exists. You can never prove that immaterial things don't exist. You're just assuming that. You have no way of knowing that for sure. But scientific naturalism seems pretty reasonable. It seems pretty logical, actually, on the surface. It seems coherent. And it seems unbiased, right? It seems objective. Because, science is objective, right? And we're all good with science being objective. But the problem is science is not the issue. It's the worldview of naturalism that's the problem. But that worldview is just being assumed. That's it. It's just being assumed without any evidence. There are significant existential metaphysical problems. Here's my Charles Darwin quote. This is from The Origin of Species, 1859. Darwin wrote this at the end of his book. But then with me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the minds of lower animals, are of any value or trustworthy at all. Would anyone trust the conviction of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind? Darwin knew that if what he observed was correct, he had no reason to conclude what he was observing was correct. Does that make sense? He can't trust himself. And this was a significant obstacle for him. Significant logical obstacle. Now, naturalists sort of just gloss over this and say, well, that was when he was kind of a theist and he believed in God and he was just kind of struggling, but really he knows that's not the case. No, those are his words. That's what he wrote. He knew there was a serious problem with this worldview. And he knew it couldn't be resolved in this way. Naturalism ultimately leads to nihilism, which Tom is going to talk about next week, which is the worldview of nothing, which is going to be another interesting worldview that we need to study. But ultimately, scientific naturalism leads to a worldview of nihilism. Now, what happens is most scientific naturalists take this worldview right up to the brink of nihilism. They look over the cliff and they back away. And they say, nope, not going there. But they're not following the evidence where it leads, which is what all good scientists are supposed to do. They're supposed to follow the evidence where it leads. But they don't, because they know where it leads, right where Nietzsche said it led. And they don't want to go there. And so we're going to look at nihilism. That's going to be an interesting worldview to study. You may encounter nihilists every now and then. 50% of every college professor on every university campus in this country holds this worldview. Half of one out of every two of your professors holds this worldview. Only 15% of the general public holds this worldview. Half of everybody on a college campus holds this worldview. It's almost impossible to think you'll get out of UNCW without encountering this worldview. It is everywhere. And it's in every field. It's not just in the sciences. It's in psychology, it's in sociology, it's in English, it's in philosophy, it's everywhere. Everywhere this worldview is found. Because it affects everything. It affects how you see everything. And so next week, Tom's going to talk about nihilism. We're going to take the worldview of naturalism to its logical conclusion. Any questions? I've kind of given you the notes here to sort of keep track of. Yes, Michael?
So if there is no purpose to anything, like we can go back to the number 7.
Yep.
So if there's no purpose to anything, shouldn't evolution like evolve and de-evolve and not really go anywhere because there's no purpose, there's no end goal? Why is it trying to survive? Why is that deemed as good?
Yeah, good question. So there's no real good answer for that. So one of the challenges, if you really want to mess up an evolutionary biologist, ask them who created Darwinian evolution. Where did that come from? Has that always existed? Or did somebody create that? Because everything in the natural world has some explanation. Doesn't mean it was created, but it had to come from somewhere. But there is no ultimate purpose. There is no ultimate purpose. So good really has no meaning. It's just whatever it is. Whatever the result of evolution is good. Because there is no purpose to it. It had no purpose. It had no goal. It just is. So, yeah. It's hard to define good because good and bad really don't exist. So an animal getting killed isn't good or bad. It just is. It's just nature. It's just evolution, right? So, yeah. It's kind of a hard thing. Yes?
Does the idea that humans need to kind of die off and nature needs to take back over, does that fall into this?
Yeah, it would. Yeah, if you really want to drive somebody crazy, say, well, you know, us humans, we're gonna eventually be replaced by the next set of higher level species. So why do we need to preserve humanity? Wouldn't that be fighting against evolution? we should want to die out, right? Because the next race of advanced creatures are going to come along. Why are you trying to preserve humanity? Why are you fighting evolution? Let us die. The next super advanced race will take over. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, there's no reason for it. Yep.
Is that kind of what Superman was about?
Uberman. Yes, Ubermensch, yes. Not yes and no. Yes and no. Yeah, sort of. I'll say sort of. That's Nietzsche's Uberman. Yes?
Wouldn't the response to that be, though, that it's just, like, evolution is itself selfish, so you're not really, you want to propagate yourself.
You do.
You're not really worried about propagating.
No.
So
Well, no, okay, only if allowing you to survive helps me to survive. Like, if your survival keeps me alive, I'm keeping you alive. Right? Because you're helping me alive. But how do I know your survival helps me survive? I don't know.
Well, it changes.
But selfishness
Yeah.
choice.
You're right.
It means choosing me over someone.
Correct. It is selfish, and Richard Dawkins wrote the book The Selfish Gene because it's trying to preserve itself. But the problem evolutionists come up with is, how do I know what is going to help me and what isn't going to help me? Because I don't know the end result until after it's over. Right? I don't know, like if a mutation happens, and I say, is that going to help me survive or not? Well, it might help me survive in this environment, but it might be a detriment in this environment. How does evolution know to pick this one and not this one? Like, does it see the future? Does it know what's coming in the future? I don't know. How does it know that? Doesn't make any sense. Yeah, it's hard to make sense of that. But it is the selfish, the selfish gene driven toward preserving its own makeup. But it's hard to figure out how that works. Yeah. Somebody had a question? Another question? No? Okay, these are a lot of things to think about, I realize. Yes, Dr. Tom.
Well, just reflecting on Freud's comment about religion being wishful thinking.
Yes.
It seems to me that in the case of Freud and Marx, the other two that you put on the board, atheism is wishful thinking. I wish that there is no God.
Oh, absolutely.
If there is no God, then
yes.
I can put myself on a pedestal.
You bet.
I can do whatever
You bet. And that's a great response to that objection. Because I can promise you, people who don't want God to exist have every bit the strongest motivation for God to not exist as you do for God to exist. I mean, if God is wishful thinking, then no God is also wishful thinking. Because then you can put yourself on the throne and you can be the measure of all things. You can be the ultimate. You can be in charge of your own destination. So, but I mean, just think about it logically. Is the fact that somebody wishes something to be true, does that mean it's false? No, not at all. I mean, even if we're all deluded into thinking God exists because we want God to exist, does that mean God doesn't exist? No, of course not. It absolutely does not mean God does not exist, right? People hold correct views for wrong reasons all the time. If God didn't really exist, it has nothing to do with whether or not we want God to exist. It's independent of what we want and what we think, just like the atheist with their view that God doesn't exist. They have every reason for God not to exist in their mind, right? So if somebody tells you Christianity is a crutch, your response is, yeah, so is atheism, right? Atheism's a crutch because they don't want God to exist, because they don't want to have to answer any questions. They don't want to have any moral judgments. They don't want to have to answer to anybody but themselves.
So John, if scientific naturalism is true, I mean, what would be your response to why we're doing anything at all?
I would say we are not choosing to do anything at all. We are predetermined to do things. Since we have no free will, we're not making any choices. So we're just doing what our genes programmed us to do. I didn't really choose to come here tonight. My DNA programmed me to come here tonight and have a good dinner and talk. But there's really no purpose other than my DNA telling me to do this. Because I have no free will. I can't freely choose anything because I'm just a biochemical machine and I'm responding to stimuli. So yeah, there's no ultimate purpose. It's just, it just is. It just is, right? So I think we talked about no overarching purpose, right? With no overarching goal. So there is no overarching goal.
So we were saying like relationships are only meant to be for our own selfish benefit.
Yep.
Like having a pet, like why does being in those relationships make us happy then? Like why does it
Yeah.
produce those specific chemicals?
Yep. And what they would say is happiness doesn't really exist. It's just your chemicals making you feel good. Hey, I like the way these chemicals make me feel, but that's it. Yep. Yeah, I mean, some people are dog people, some people are cat people, right? Cats make my chemicals get all, and dogs, right? But maybe you're a cat person, right? So your chemicals are different. Okay, that's cool. But there really is no good or bad, no right or wrong. It's just our chemicals just doing their thing, right? So, yeah. I mean, it really is. Yeah, Alexa, you're going to say something? Oh, yeah. Okay. I'm going to be around for a while. So if you want to come and chat, I'm here. I'm not going to leave for a while because I know there's probably a lot of things that are going on in your mind. But I'm going to go ahead and pray, and then we'll go ahead and be dismissed. Yeah, we'll let everybody go. If you need to go, that's great. Appreciate everybody coming tonight. Did everybody have a handout? Did everybody get a handout? Wow. Because I think we're probably close to 80 here tonight. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and pray. Dear Lord, thank you for tonight, and thank you for each one that's here. We thank you for the Simpsons and their graciousness to have us all here with a great meal and great fellowship. We pray you would be with each one that's here tonight. Pray for the students, Lord. I know that they're going to constantly be under attack. from many different sides and many different worldviews. And I pray, Lord, that they will think about some of the things we talked about, that it'll help them to prepare their minds and their hearts for the things they're going to encounter. I pray that they would just thoughtfully consider some of the things we've discussed tonight. And Lord, I just pray that you would be with them this semester, continue to just protect them and watch over them. We thank you for Ratio Christi. We thank you for this ministry. We pray you would be with us now and be with us this week. And we ask it in Christ's name. Amen.
Feel free to hang out.
So next week we're back on campus, right?
Back on campus.
So back in the exam room. Next week's worldview is
Yes, ma'am.
I need some book
recommendations.
Okay. Well, it's probably been a while since we've had. Yeah.
Specifically about this topic.
Okay.
This is one that
You run across this one a lot.